This is now lecture 4 on contextualization, the process of applying truth to a new context. So in our previous lectures up to this point, we started out in lecture 1 developing a biblical theology of missions and culture. And then we moved to survey some of the complexities that happen with culture. And we recognize that there are multiple levels as we deal with culture. The reality that the behaviors we often focus on are just the very surface level within cultural analysis. And then we went onwards to recognize a whole map of other values that might appear in respect to culture. So we gave a variety of these kinds of discussions, systems or representations that look like this, many different ways that we could talk about cultural values or cultural systems. In our last lecture, we moved outwards from that and we began talking about cross-cultural communication. And we recognized here that when two cultures collide or interact, specifically when two cultures seek to communicate, that we get this kind of dynamic, the sender, the receiver, and then the messages sent across, well, they're not just so simple as a single piece of information sent across, kind of like a photon of light or something that goes across. No, in actuality, there's a whole set of dynamics with sending messages, receiving messages, right? And then the critical thing that changes everything, noise. And our whole discussion last time with cross-cultural communication revolved around this. How do we deal with the problem of noise? How do we communicate in such a way that we're able to get our message across without it being distorted? And that really brings us to where we're at in our discussion today. Because here we're recognizing that communication is not only just sending messages per se, but communication comes in a variety of forms. We've already hinted at this, the recognition that communication can be in body language, or it can be in a particular way that you communicate, like your attitudes, and even just who you are, because people have assumptions about your identity. But let's recognize further that communication can be, we've already observed, a set of practices. It can be a certain set of things you do. And now, if I'm defining culture as we've talked about it, not just culture for a nation, but culture in a subset, like culture of a church or Christian culture within a given context, then we recognize that certain practices in that context might mean things. So that an outsider walking in might look at a behavior or two and not realize that there's a whole lot of information that's being communicated inside those practices. Those practices, those symbols, those expressions mean something. And so when an outsider comes in, they might not recognize it, and an insider would recognize the additional meaning that's being communicated. I'll just give you an example or two that would represent this. There was a situation or a question in Zambia about when you go to a funeral. And there were certain processes that you do, washing your hands as you entered and things like that, that as an outsider, I thought, well, it's always nice to wash your hands or wash your feet or something like that. But an insider would say, oh, actually, this has to do with cleansing yourself because of the spirits, because the dead person, now there's evil spirits about. Okay, as an outsider, I don't have any awareness of that. As an insider, you would. So how do we process this? Or how should we think about it? And that really introduces our concept. Our concept today of contextualization explores the process of how you communicate the gospel faithfully in another context in a way that's going to be meaningful. So let me start out and I'll give you a couple of definitions of contextualization. Here's one from Scott Moreau. It's taking the gospel to a new context, finding appropriate ways to communicate it, so that it is understandable to the people in that context. And this language right here is really helpful. Appropriate Christianity refers to more than just theology. It also includes developing church life and ministry in ways that are biblically faithful and culturally appropriate. Let's get another definition or two. How about these? The process whereby Christians adapt to the forms, content, praxis of the Christian faith so as to communicate it to the minds and hearts of people with other cultural backgrounds. The goal to make the Christian faith as a whole, not only the message, not only the verbal propositional information, but also the ways of living the faith out in the local setting, understandable. You're trying to find out how people think through this, and then you're trying to teach them how to live it out. Two more definitions here. This is from Charles Kraft. Contextualization seeks an appropriate Christianity, a Christian expression that is appropriate both to a given social context and to scriptures. I think that's helpful, appropriate, between an accurate representation of what scripture tells us to do. You must, that's the absolute authority, you must conform to that. But on the other side, recognizing that each context has different demands or different meanings that are applied. And finally, the worst of the definitions, my own, applying biblical truth to diverse cultural settings or situations so that believers live faithfully and appropriately in their individual context. A very simple definition that maybe grabs what we're going after. So let me zoom out a little bit. And before I go further down the track of contextualization, I'd like to build the case a little bit more for the necessity of contextualization. What I mean by that is I'd like us to think a bit more about culture and how profoundly different culture can be, how it affects the way we think, feel, act in the world in which we live, and then how this would shape our responses, or even our Christian testimony or our Christian obedience. I've shown you a number of different cultural values. I'd like to go down at this point a list of some specific cultural values that I think are worth focusing on. And what I mean by that is we've talked about various values, but do we have a more detailed understanding of what I'm going to give you 10 different specific values that I've, in each case, put on a spectrum? Okay, and the idea would go all the way across from, let's just give another example that's not cultural, very rich Elon Musk, currently the richest person in the world as of 2023, all the way across to very, very poor, the person who has literally nothing. Okay, so there's a spectrum. Everybody falls somewhere within that spectrum. That's the concept we're going for. And I'm going to give you a number of different cultural values for us to break that down with, or for us to think about, starting off with individualism versus collectivism. The argument would be that to some extent, one extent or the other, every culture would express its values on this plane, from individualism to collectivism. There would be some balance of your particular culture and how it values these things. Let me give an illustration or two with each one of these. I'll start out with the individualism idea. And a person who is familiar with a North American context would very much recognize some patterns with this, because this is a massively controlling value for North Americans, for Americans, Canadians, and beyond, to some extent even a number of European cultures, Australia. The idea of this would go, when you make a comment something like, well, I don't care what anybody else thinks. I got to do what's right for me. I got to do the thing that is natural to me, or this is my personality. Well, this is just the way I am. A kind of a concept that I can push aside the concerns of the rest of the group, the collective group, and I'll just radically express, this is the way I think. This is the way I feel. I speak my mind, and if you don't like it, deal with it. Very much an individualistic perspective. I'll go across to collectivism. Contrasting here, I'm going to think here of the Philippines. And when I would watch, from time to time, I'd be on a bus and there would be a video up with TV ads playing. And they might play a little trailer of troops going out, Filipino troops. It's an advertisement to get people to sign up for the military. Well, the American form of signing up for the military would always be these huge guys jumping out of helicopters, or climbing over the top of a mountain, or Navy SEALs coming up from underwater. And it was kind of, the imagery was, you'll be awesome. You'll be the hero. I think at one point the military even used that as a slogan, be everything you can be. maximize your potential. It's you-centric. Okay, that's an American framework. I would watch Filipino presentations, same type of ads, guys in fatigues, military thing, and there's a lot of like raw masculinity on show there. But you would see the guys going out, and instead they're plucking somebody out of a flood, carrying a child over their shoulder. They're carrying huge sacks of rice over, and they're helping the community, and people are gratefully looking, oh wow, and accepting bags of rice. Okay, kind of the imagery of you're an important part of the community. If you have this, what is heroism? What is greatness? The community is grateful for you. The community is in awe of how you've helped them. Okay, do you see the distinction between those? Another example, my pastor in the Philippines was just making an application, and he was talking about if somebody turned away from the Lord. So if someone left the faith. And one of his arguments among many, he just said, well, what would be the impact on the rest of this church body if you departed? Argument being that one of the legitimate biblical reasons you should be afraid of apostatizing is the shame and, yes, the destruction you would bring on that church body. See, I think that's an application that an American pastor could make, maybe should make, but we wouldn't tend to make it because on the individualism plane, it's really just kind of all about you. It's all about that one individual. So individualism versus collectivism, I think, is a huge distinction, especially for someone in a North American context to understand, because you have to recognize that we are somewhere on this extreme individualism side, highly valuing the individual person's ability to do whatever they want to do without the encumbrances of the impact on everyone else. Okay, let's keep on going. A second value, low versus high power distance, is a major concept. And this would be the idea of how you interact with somebody who's different from you on kind of the prestige scale. So let's say a pastor, a president, a prime minister, a person of some importance or repute. If you interact with them, what would you view as a good way for them to interact? And I'm going to, again, through many of these, talk about a North American context because many of the people that I interact with or that may be watching this are hearing it in a North American context. We would tend to really prize and value someone who deals with us in an egalitarian way. In other words, he might be the CEO of the company, but we like this. But I never would have guessed because he just treated me like completely normal. I mean, he might be the prime minister, he might be the president, but when I spoke with him, he just spoke with me as person to person. That's very egalitarian, or on this plane, low power distance, meaning the distance between the follower and the leader. We love it when that person just comes right on down. Versus a high power distance context, the assumption would be that the pastor, the prime minister, the president, the important person should keep a good distance between him and his followers. Okay, that's a cultural decision. And examples that occur to me like this, I had a conversation with someone in Hong Kong, and he just said, as a pastor, the church is cleaning up after an event, they're putting away tables, chairs, that sort of thing. And so his instinct, because he was American, was, okay, I'll jump in there and I'll pick up the chairs too. I'll carry the tables along with everybody else because I just, I want to show them that I'm normal. And some of the people there were a little horrified, like, no, you don't do that. No, we'll take care of it. You just sit down, relax. Okay, and that feels weird, probably, to an American pastor because you just want to be one of the guys. But no, in this cultural context, the expectation would be there's a massive disconnect or a massive distance, high respect. A lot of the cultures in this framework would even have ways, either through body language. In the Philippines, you might take an older person's hand and you'd bless. In parts of Southeast Asia, India, then you might do like this. In many other places, you would bow. All of these are expressions of respect. In Japanese and Korean, there are a series of different particles that would express levels of respect. In the Philippines and Tagalog, there's definitely a particle you include in there, a little word that you insert in order to always be respectful. Okay, these are high emphases on respect. Let's go to a third. How about low versus high uncertainty avoidance? And here's an idea that in some contexts, you want things to be clear. You want things to be unambiguous. Give me the instructions, make them explicit, tell me exactly what I'm supposed to do, and then I'll just go straight down. And if there's any ambiguity, some uncertainty, well, what's the schedule tomorrow? Well, let's see how the day goes. Okay, that's considered totally unacceptable. Like, I need to know. I need to know the plan. Sorry, if you don't tell me exactly what I'm supposed to do, don't expect me to come through because you didn't give me the information. There are other contexts, sorry, I said that backwards. That what I just described would be high uncertainty avoidance. You want to avoid any uncertainties. Okay, but on the other side, low uncertainty avoidance, well, life happens. You can't really know. It's just, you just take it as it comes. It's kind of unknowable. Which probably is related to the next. Excuse me, I've got a different order on here. But one of the concepts that comes up often is a concept of crisis orientation versus long-range planning. And the idea there would be, well, you kind of can't know what's going to happen. So you just take it as it comes, just hope for the best. Okay, versus other contexts where you definitely plan on, you definitely have to know what's coming up. Okay, I apologize for the order problem there. The next one that I'll talk about here would be cooperative versus competitive relationships. This is the idea within a context. Do I look at my peers and do I try to get ahead of them? Or do I look at my peers and say, no, they're people that work together with me. We pursue the same goals together, okay? How much is this a cooperative, let's work together thing versus how much is this a, hey, it's normal, people are going to have to compete for the resources? Related or continuing on, a direct communication versus indirect communication style. There are going to be some contexts where, truthfully, it's just kind of expected that you wouldn't say exactly what you intend. You kind of say it in a roundabout way. I've been in places before where someone kind of, like, they tell a story, and the story has a point, and you have to listen for it, versus an indirect communication style, or direct communication style, where you just say it. North American context would be very direct. They would put an emphasis on, well, it's best to just put it all out there. I mean, maybe somebody won't like it, but just say it, okay? Indirect, maybe you would just kind of hint at it. Or in some contexts, you might tell your friend and ask your friend to tell the person. I think I mentioned in a previous lecture an interaction with a Filipino pastor who just said that when he would interact with fellow Filipinos, then he assumed, well, there's probably a hint going on here. When he would interact with Americans, the assumption was, they just mean what they said. They just put it out there bluntly. And if you hear that and your heart or your mind immediately goes, much better to just say it straight out, or you have a preference for one or the other, you're probably giving way a little bit. What is your cultural preset? You like it because it's your system and you're used to it, and therefore it works for you. Let's go to another set here. Inherited status versus achieved status. For an extreme of this, if you want to think of the caste system in India, the idea that you're born into a certain status, I mean, that's who you are, that's your family, that's your people, and that's just the way it is. And so there's no changing it. You're just kind of assigned that. Versus achieved status, very much merits. You earn your status. If you have higher status, if you're the CEO of a large company, or if you manage to start something and it goes big, or if a lot of people are impressed with what you did, or you get a lot of books published, you've achieved status. Okay, a North American context is a very achieved status context. Because you don't just have status by birth. Nobody really gets much status by birth. In fact, it's almost, there's a distrust to someone who has status by birth. The assumption is, well, that's something you work for. And therefore, mark this as a negative backside to it. Therefore, if you do not achieve and excel, then you're an unacceptable person because you must not have worked hard enough to get to where you could have otherwise been. In limited good versus unlimited good, an interesting concept here, the idea that the good in the world, this could be financial, but it could be more than that, is kind of a fixed status. So if you see within this context a person who's very wealthy or who has a nice life, the life that everybody wants, the assumption is he must have robbed someone else. Someone else must be suffering because there's only, if you want to imagine it, like, a million oodles of good in the world. And if that guy's got a large share of it, a couple of thousand out of the million, then other people are down in the 2 and 3 oodles of good, right? Versus an unlimited good society, the assumption, well, as the economy flourishes, as people work, well, then, you can just keep on getting better and better. There's more and more benefit out there. Particularism versus universalism. The question here goes, do we sometimes make principles, rules for this particular situation? Or do we just set out principles and those principles are true everywhere, always, in every situation? See, and the universalist idea was we ought to be consistent. Be consistent with everything. Don't make exceptions. Particularism, well, for the sake of a person, for the sake of an odd situation, yeah, sure, just do it differently. It's okay. We don't have to be consistent. The law is made for the man, not the man for the law. There's a certain insight to that. Demonstrative communication versus concealed restraint. The question here goes, do you let out what you're thinking? Do you just communicate it all? Very much in a North America context, well, I just say it like it is. I say how I feel. I put it all out there. Bob, he just communicates his thoughts, sets it all out there. He doesn't worry about what impact that has. That's a very demonstrative communication view. If you want to think here of Latin contexts or Italian contexts, lots is said, lots of communication is put out there. A concealed restraint, the person who's opaque, the person who thinks something, feels something, interacts a certain way, but it's not seen. Face is flat. There's no communication. I'm not going to tell you what I'm thinking. And here, there's a certain benefit to that. You might be thinking something, but it doesn't need to be said. There's a wisdom in not saying everything that you think. And finally, my last value here, tight cultural grids versus loose cultural grids. My concept here would go that there are some contexts where you must fit the expectations of the grid around you. Pretty much everyone, they think of the way it ought to be in a very narrowly defined way. The ought to be is very tight. And there are other contexts where variation within the culture can be really broad. You can have lots of variations, lots of ways of doing it, and I would call that a looser cultural grid. Okay, so there are a bunch of these values. I would like to show you, though, recognize that every person fits onto these grids in different ways. So if I bring all of the grids back in here together, we can recognize that it's not as though a certain culture like falls on the left-hand side of the grid and everybody's there. On the contrary, a certain culture, yes, even an individual, could fall all over the place in the way they fit onto this grid. It's dispersed. And it's not even like a certain value, let's say the blue up here, means that you're going to follow through and you're also going to do the green up here because it's on that side. Or the blue, if you're on the far left, means that you're going to be on the far right with a pink. Or, I mean, you can have all kinds of configurations. There are some patterns. Some of these values are related to others. There are other values that I didn't include in here that cultural discussions can have. Okay, and we recognize that culture is complex enough that all of these can be configured in very diverse ways. In fact, really, I ought to probably represent it something like this, using kind of the central point, the crossover point between all of them, as the point that we're choosing. And every cultural value is pointing out in a different way. You can almost even imagine this in 3 dimensions if you wanted. In other words, it's a complex network. And yes, some of these values impact other values to a limited extent, and yet not in an absolutely determinative way. Now, here's then where this starts to apply directly to contextualization. Remember that as we worked down through that set of different cultural configurations, there were some of these that at the extreme actually could start to be a biblical issue. In other words, if I just take one of the slides and let's just say we take the direct communication styles question. I mean, there's a kind of direct communication style that is foolish. Like you just shouldn't say that. There's a kind of individualism that says, I don't care what anybody thinks. I'm just going to do what's right for me, which is basically selfish, right? I mean, there's a kind of competitive relationships thinking that's very destructive to relationships. In fact, I would argue that probably on almost all of these points, the very end of the arrows starts to get out to a place where it's no longer ethical. If you get to the extremes, there's a reason that humans don't go out there that often. They don't go out there that often because it doesn't work. And it doesn't work because it's starting to hit up against realities of the way the world is built that make it impossible for you to do those things and still be able to function well. So we're starting now to recognize that these are cultural values, but just to say because they're cultural doesn't mean at all that they're neutral. On the contrary, some of these are going to be quite ethically bound. Some of these are going to be quite important in obedience, biblical obedience. Which leads me into a bit of a discussion here. How do we talk about ethics? Like, what is ethics, or what is a biblical framework for thinking about ethics? I'll just give you a passing definition for ethics. I define provisionally ethics as the discourse or the discussion that teaches us how to live well. Ethics teaches you to live well. Or if I gave a longer definition, ethics teaches us how to live well in light of what is true and beautiful. Okay, and on that grid then, we can recognize that some of these quote-unquote cultural values we've just discussed have massive ethical implications. You've got to get some of these cultural values right if you're going to live ethically. Let's illustrate it a little bit, and I'll start out by illustrating it not exactly with a culture per se, but it's actually in this case with a religion. So I'll talk about Christian ethics, and next to it, I'm just going to contrast this with secularism. I'm talking here about a view that doesn't posit or doesn't recognize the existence of God. So I'm talking here not about cultures as much as worldviews. And I'm recognizing that secularism, for instance, would permit abortion, non-traditional marriage. Secularism would answer, sure, those things are fine. Christianity on its side would say that proselytizing or child discipline, those things are okay, where secularism would probably tend to reject those. And then you have a massive area in the middle where on, let's say, murder, suicide, violence, most forms of lying, both secularism and Christian ethics would agree that these things are good things, bad things. Okay, I can flip this around and we can do the same kind of analysis if I take, let's say, Christian ethics and I compare this with Islam. And I can recognize that under the ethical constraints of Islam, polygamy and jihad are considered acceptable. Within Christianity, eating pork or women without head coverings, those are considered acceptable. And then you have a large area in the middle, most forms of adultery, most forms of stealing, that both Christian ethics and Islam would agree. Those things are wrong. And other things that both Christianity and Islam would agree are good, giving tithes or being kind to the poor and those types of things. Okay, so that would be the way that religions intersect. Now let's do this with culture. And I'm going to give you two different cultures, and let's do the same analysis. Again, we're starting out with Christian ethics. I'm going to compare that with American culture. And I'm going to recognize that within American culture, talking about honoring your parents, there would be certain things that I would call a biblical ethic. So American culture would permit someone to say demeaning things about them on social media. I mean, that's just considered like normal. American culture would give you a coming of age narrative. When you get to your teens, you've got to throw off your parents and you got to get freedom from them. Okay, and these are areas of drawn the arrows in here to say those are things that American culture allows, but they're not actually biblical. They fall outside of a Christian ethic. Okay, flip it around on the opposite side. On the opposite side, Christian ethical expressions of honoring father and mother. A Christian ethic would say care for them in their elderly years, listen to them, ask for advice. And American culture could care less about those things. And my argument then would go that Christian ethics is both tighter in some ways and other ways, or it eliminates certain things. In other ways, it commands certain things that American culture would either be okay with or reject. So American culture differs from Christian ethics in these respects on one command: honor father and mother. How would a Filipino apply the honor and father and mother command? And here would be ways that Filipino culture might tend to get things wrong. Living abroad, leaving your parents to care for their grandchildren, making fun of the elderly for holding to traditional beliefs. Okay, those are things that Filipino culture would view as acceptable, but Christian ethics says no. On the other side, live with your parents. Fulfill the responsibilities of the kuya or the ate. Those are responsibilities by birth order. Okay, those are things that Filipino culture would say you should do. And actually, I mean, they fit pretty well with Christian ethics. And if I put that together, then I'm recognizing that the process of bringing culture or ethics to a specific context can be pretty different. Americans dealing with honor of father and mother are going to have a certain set of distinct temptations that Filipinos won't face. And a Filipino might look across at an American and say, why on earth did you, for instance, put your parents in an extended care facility? I mean, you threw them away and paid off, kind of like paid money to take care of them instead of you taking care of them yourself. I mean, that seems very disrespectful. They have a point. But in an American context, it's like, well, that's just what you do. Okay, and we're recognizing then differences in the contextualized expectations of where things ought to go. Let me give you a few more examples that would work like this. Places or contexts where the ethic or the application might be a little bit different. So, for instance, in an Indian context, should Christians arrange marriages for their children? A Westerner would feel pretty strongly who I'm going to be married to for the rest of my life. I should be able to decide that. Like, you're not going to tell me who I'm going to marry. I want to decide who I will marry. Okay, but then does the missionary coming across into a context like India come in and say, Christian ethics tells you that you should not demand that your children marry a certain person. Give them liberty to decide. I mean, I've not lived in India. You'd have to explore that. But see, this is a contextual question. And even more difficult, what about when the parents tell their children to do something and it actually conflicts with biblical principles? Like, marry this Hindu. And then the child is going to need to make a difficult cultural choice in order to avoid sinning. Let's go to sub-Saharan Africa. What's the proper response to a polygamous marriage? A man has 4 wives. Well, it's real easy. Split them up. Okay, children? And what about the care of these different wives? Okay, because that woman, if she's just sent out, she's probably going to starve. I mean, nobody wants to pick her up. Nobody wants to care for her. And she probably can't get a job. She's been dependent. So what do? How about let's go to the USA and Canada. How does, and UK, other Western contexts, how does Christianity intersect with politics? Should Christians support social justice issues in the public space? Should they picket abortion clinics? If that's something the government tells them they can't they can't be standing around in front of an abortion clinic, do you do it anyway? How do you intersect with politics? How much does your Christianity start to shape your political views? And do we want to look at a certain party and say that party is the Christian party? How do you process that out? Back to sub-Saharan Africa, should believers be engaged in coming-of-age rituals? And some of these rituals are pretty bad. You're putting young 13, 14-year-old boys or girls through a lot of pain. And the kind of idea is, well, we need to harden them, toughen them up. Do you want to put them through that pain? And at the same time, though, if you just rip that out culturally, you may not recognize a lot of unintended consequences. You're going to change, you're going to disconnect child or young people from elders. And so you're going to create situations where there's intergenerational tension. So how are you going to navigate that? I mean, you can create some really fast major issues by just ripping something out of a cultural context. Do you understand what that is there for and what it accomplishes in the culture before you take it out? I'm going to jump here to some places like Singapore, other Southeast Asian contexts. Should believers be buried instead of cremated? A lot of these contexts, the believers want to be buried, but let's say in Singapore, they don't have a lot of land. And so what you do is you can pay to be buried. You basically pay rent. And they'll put you in that spot for, a period of 50 years or something. But when all of the relatives are gone, when a certain period of time, basically when the money runs out, then they're going to take you out and they're going to cremate you and put the ashes elsewhere. So how do you deal with that? Because eventually you're going to be pulled out of the ground. I mean, eventually the money will run out. How do you think about cremation versus burial? How about views of communication? I spoke before about direct versus indirect communication styles. There are some contexts that have a view of truthfulness. How blunt should you be? And if you weren't just saying what you meant, that you were almost lying, how do you process that out? How about complexities with marriage and divorce? In the Philippines, there is no marriage, or there is no divorce, excuse me. It doesn't exist legally. Now, you can actually pay a lot of money and get an annulment, which is a legal kind of loophole where you can basically cancel out the marriage and say it didn't count, but you have to have a bunch of money to do that. Only the wealthy aristocracy are able to pull it off, which might sound great to a lot of us, and I'm definitely against no-fault divorce or just the ease with which divorce laws have come about. But let's recognize that messy things happen. And so I've known contexts now where people early, when they were in their 20s, married somebody, it lasted for a couple of years, and then they left them, but they can't get a legal divorce. And now for 30 years, they've lived together with someone, they've parented, they have children, they have a home together, and now in their elderly years, the man dies, and the family of the woman from 30 years before show up and they take all of his assets. And the person he lived with for 30 years has nothing. Okay, because legally it was still on the books that he was still technically married. And it becomes really a kind of injustice. So what do you do in those kinds of situations? Really complex. I'll give you a last example. This is also taken from the Philippines, but the Philippines pays a lot of attention to birth order. And so the oldest child, or the older child, if he's a male, is going to be called Koya. And if it's a female, Ate. And you pay attention to that. So it would actually be considered kind of disrespectful or cheeky for a younger child to speak to an older sibling and not use those words. Is that something that is within biblical ethical confines? Should you do that? When I was there, my children in the Philippines, would I expect them to say Koya and Ate to their older siblings when I knew that coming back to the US, nobody would know what that meant? So if I required my children to speak a certain way, like all the time, kind of like saying a yes sir, yes ma'am, that habit, how do I have them shift when they move between cultures? What do we do? And what I've done is just try to lay out a whole bunch of contexts or situations where ethics and culture are in some way intersecting, and you're having to make a decision. How do you process out intercultural communication? How do you process out differences between these different cultures? And how do you do it in a way that's going to lead to appropriate Christian living that takes us to where we believe people ought to go or how they ought to act? Do we have any kind of basis for this type of discussion in Scripture? Does Scripture show us any of these complexities? And the answer is, well, yes, a little bit. A couple of examples come to mind. Here's one. 2 Kings 5 is the example of Naaman. Now, he's just been healed. And after having then been healed, come to the conclusion that Yahweh, the God of Israel, is the true God. Then he comes back to Elijah, and there's a bit of a request here. And the request goes, let me request, he says, give me 2 mules burden of earth, because I will not henceforth anymore offer burnt offering nor sacrifice to other gods, only to Yahweh. So Naaman at this point plans to worship the true God. In this one thing, the Lord pardon your servant. When my master goes into the house of Rimmon to worship there, Naaman is a man working together with the king of his nation. When my master goes to worship in the house of Rimmon, the house of a false god, and he leans on my hand, and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, and we don't know exactly what's going on here, but it seems like maybe they go together and the master bows. And for Naaman not to bow, it's not just an issue of him failing to bow to the idol, but it's actually disrespect to the king. Because at this point, the king is bowing, but Naaman's not. So Naaman is disrespecting his master. When I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, the Lord pardoned thy servant in this thing. And Elijah's response to him, go in peace. So he departed. Okay, what's the situation then? I think that's the analysis. Basically, Naaman wants to serve Yahweh as his God. Okay, but if he reacts in certain ways, it's going to actually communicate disrespect to his king, his authority. And so when the king bows, Naaman will bow down, not for the sake of Rimmon, but for the sake of the king, Naaman will also bow down. He's recognizing it's complicated, and so he's asking, well, will the Lord forgive me for that? Is that okay? I think this is a contextualization type issue. It's a hard question that comes up, specifically because of the difficulties that happen with, yes, contextualization. Another really great way to see this kind of concept is to pay attention to the differences between sermons that we find in the book of Acts. So here, this is Acts 7, and this is Stephen preaching. And I won't read it, but if you just notice all the way down here, what you're reading is the story of the nation of Israel. The story of the nation of Israel, how they at different times rejected God, rebelled against God. And the conclusion, when we get down to the end of this chapter, you stick-necked, uncircumcised in heart and ears, you always resist the Holy Spirit. You've persecuted all of the prophets, and now you've also rejected the Messiah. Okay, it's a very Jewish-oriented, if you just went through and you counted up all the references to Egypt and David and all of the patriarchs, all of these Jewish-oriented things, Stephen is very much preaching a message designed for Jews. But I turn around and I find Paul preaching later on. He's going to preach in another context, also a very Jewish-oriented passage or sermon. And this is very much for Jews. Why? Because he's in front of Jews. Get a little bit later, and he's going to preach here to an agrarian context, that God who made heaven and earth and sea and all the things that are therein, he has not left himself without witness. He's given us rain and fruitful seasons. He's filled our hearts with food and gladness. When he preaches to farmers, he preaches differently. When he preaches to philosophers, he preaches differently. Now here I've got a lot of philosophical argument. And I'm just recognizing all the way through that you've got different communication, different emphases to different situations. It's a kind of a contextualization because you're interacting with different people in different ways. Let's take one more. In Acts 15, there's a difficult issue going on with how Jews and Gentiles are going to relate. And one of the conclusions of that discussion, they said that we want to lay on you no burden than these necessary things. But to the Gentiles, tell them to abstain from meat offered to idols, from blood, from things strangled, and from fornication. If you keep yourself away from these things, you do well. Okay, now some of these are obvious. Fornication, we know that that's a standard Christian ethic. Some of these are a little bit controversial. Keep your self away from blood and from things strangled. That's kind of Jewish kosher food laws. And so there are people, theologians, that believe that even, yes, for New Testament believers, we should be careful about eating food that's not in these ways. You shouldn't consume blood. This is not just theoretical. There is a soup in the Philippines called duguan, and it's made from pig blood. All right, so if I believe, as I read this passage, that this passage is authoritative for us today, I shouldn't eat that. Other people do. Okay, and for myself, I think it's a little more complicated. Because the other part of this passage, that you abstain from meat offered to idols. Well, you have a further discussion, remember, in 1 Corinthians 8 and 10, that allows for some situations where you would eat meat offered to idols. So what's going on here? I mean, is this authoritative for us? Don't eat the blood for us as New Testament believers. And I think you're caught here between something that is a clear biblical ethic and something else that's clearly contextual. I think what you're dealing with in this passage, however you want to carve it up, even if you have a different conclusion on the ethicality of Christians today eating blood, I think what you have here is an expression of contextualization. I think the apostles are concerned about relationship between Jew and Gentile. And they're saying, for the sake of relationship, and in this context, in this situation, just skip it. Don't eat the blood. Don't eat things strangled. In this respect, don't do the things that would be the most offensive so that we can find some kind of way to build relationship. Now that then takes me to talk about how we do some of this analysis. How do we actually think it through, or how do we process it out? And I want to give you a couple of other kind of conceptual grids for thinking about this. Remember, I talked earlier about biblical ethics and cultures, and the fact that they kind of overlap in some ways and they don't overlap in some ways. One of the problems we get is a big word called syncretism. And syncretism is when I try to take my culture, biblical ethics, and I try to fuse them in a way that actually ends up violating biblical ethics. I'll give you a couple of examples. Let's talk about, in some discussions, people that think that it's possible to worship Jesus in the mosque. You go in, you do your Muslim prayers, you're a Muslim insider, you don't tell anybody that you've converted, you worship in the mosque, and just as you pray all your prayers, you pray to Allah, but what you mean by Allah is God, the God of the Bible. And then kind of you just in your mind substitute in Isa, Jesus, for every reference to Muhammad, and you just kind of do that, the prophet. But what you mean by that is the prophet, Jesus. And you kind of do this in this kind of undercover way, and it's possible to be a Christian. Okay, I regard this as a deep syncretism, because you've found some kind of way to maintain a false religion, a false culture, or sinful aspect of a culture in the name of Christianity. Let me move it across to a North American or a Western context. I think that prosperity theology is a massive expression of syncretism. Because what you've done is you've found some way to take biblical ethics, obedience to God and His Word, and you've carved that into what a culture cares about: money, success, prosperity. And you've offered to them, saying to them, well, if you just play the game right, you can have all the good stuff. And it's a syncretism because you've mixed two different things that don't belong together. You've mixed together biblical ethics and bad thinking to give people what they want. And so you've ended up with this kind of fused form of something very distorted and disturbing. Biblical ethics and cultural ethics wrapped up in as one, when in fact they don't really go together as one. So syncretism would be one of the great problems or concerns of cultural ethics and how we deal with them. How do we try to guard against it? And that is this process now of contextualization. Here I'm taking from a Standard Journal article called Critical Contextualization by Hebert. And he proposes a process for how we would think about this. You start out recognizing an existing cultural practice. Let's say something like the coming of age rites in Africa. And you ask yourself, is this acceptable? Like a person now has come to faith. Should they continue to do this? Or do we need to teach them now to stop doing it because it's a sinful part of the culture? Should they eliminate this from their lives? Or is this an okay thing for the church to continue to practice? And his recommendation for the analysis goes, you've got options. One option is wholesale acceptance. You say, well, it's part of the culture. It's okay. It must be okay. So let's just keep on doing it. All right. But I mean, what if it's cruel? In many of these contexts, it can be. What if it has sexual overtones to it? I mean, what if there's a lot of stuff going on here that's kind of perverse and tainted? Okay. Well, the problem when you do that is you're going to get syncretism. You're going to have people doing sinful things in the name of Christianity. You're going to say, I'm a faithful Christian, and I practice this sinful practice. I mean, an extreme of this would be, let's say, a person who claims to be a faithful Christian, but he also still maintains and sleeps with 4 wives. Okay, that's a syncretism. You've mixed biblical culture or biblical ethics and a pagan culture in a sinful way. Move that across to the opposite side. Wholesale rejection would be the approach that just says, okay, it's part of the culture. I reject it. It must be sinful. I'm going to get rid of the whole thing. And so in this case, we would rip it out of the culture. We say, okay, get up in a church service as we're planning a new church. And we say to them, all of this coming of age stuff, sin, stop it, get rid of the whole thing. And let's go back to the polygamy. If it's polygamy, you need to send those wives out. I mean, just simple, easy, send them out. Don't talk to them again. Get rid of them. Treat it as if, in a Western context, the person had multiple affairs. Just break those relationships off. No more contact with those people. What's going to happen, Hebert argues, in those situations is that you're going to get one of 2 bad outcomes. Either you're going to end up with the foreigner's God. The idea that over time, people would feel like this isn't really their thing. This is like your thing. Or they would view this as a Western thing. Oh, the Westerners live this way. And so no surprise, their religion also works this way. So this is how they do life. And so they don't have a coming of age ceremony. So therefore, Christianity doesn't either. But, it's a Western thing. Yeah, that's the way it works. It's just an external foreigner's God thing. Or more realistically, what you're going to get is underground practices. You're going to drive it underground, meaning because the people know that your solution doesn't work, because they know that just kicking the wives out is actually really terrible. Those women are maybe going to starve. The children are going to grow up without a father. Those 3 families are going to be destitute. They know that the situation is really, really bad. And they know that your situation is no good. It's just going to go underground. So they'll kind of externally, publicly, okay, pastor, and they kind of, all right, do that. But in truth, they sent them to a nearby village. From time to time, the man sneaks out there, he sleeps with the wives, and he comes home. And it's underground. They're just not telling you. And so the whole setting around you, they kind of, oh yeah, pastor, no, good, okay, because that's the only solution you've given them. The only option they really have is to play along if they want to be part of the church you started and keep up with things. And the result of that, Hebert points out, really interesting, is that whether you go with wholesale acceptance or with wholesale rejection, you actually end up in the same place. Both of these end up in syncretism. Do you see how the wholesale rejection, underground push, has resulted in a syncretism? Because now the guy is still just sneaking off quietly, a little bit embarrassed, going out late at night to sleep with his wives. But in effect, we're in the same place. He still is sleeping with the wives on the side. It's a syncretism. You haven't actually changed anything. And Hebert's suggestion in the middle between these things is this contextualization process. What does that look like? He gives an entire breakdown of the process, but his biggest insight would be, we'll work together with some of the people of this church. Go find faithful believers that are already starting to live out their Christianity, starting to show what one ought to do, and then work with them. Ask them questions. Rely on them as a resource. Find other faithful believers in the context, have a conversation, and work through this together. And that process would probably look something like this. You'd start out by clarifying the question. What exactly are you asking? I mean, what is the question? If I give, let's say, the polygamy example, what should we do with a situation of man with multiple wives? How do we deal with biblical sexual ethics? He shouldn't be sleeping with 4 women. Together with biblical concerns for the care of these people, making sure that they are not destitute. Clarify the question. What are the options? What decisions can you make? List out the options. All the way from the extreme, the man just kicks the 3 women out and never has communication with them again. Or let's say on the other side, we just say, well, it's a bad thing, but it already happened. It's part of the culture. We'll just let him keep on sleeping with them. Okay, those are our 2 extremes. Now let's work through all the gradations in between. Could the church pick up some of the responsibility? Could the man give some funds and then, or give some cattle or give some resources and then someone else helps to take care of the women? Or could the man continue to care for the families, but he's not going to sleep with the wives, and so they live in a separate place, a little distance away, but he's still able to interact with the children? How do we work through some options? Gather any biblical information you can. Work through all of Scripture. Try to find whatever Scripture says that might help this. Never violate a clear teaching from Scripture. Look for broad principles. And then work through what would be the impact of each option. Weigh the pros and the cons. Consider all of the questions within the real world. Now, I have to add to this, and the thing that I'm assuming all the way through, is that this is not just a thing you do in isolation. As the missionary separate, just kind of making the decision, then you walk out and you tell everyone, here it is. But you work through it together with the people. You actually use this as a relationship building thing. At each one of these stages, you sit down with them and you ask them, what would be the cultural impact on each one of those? What are your concerns? What do you think might happen? What do you think might go wrong? And your endeavor through the whole thing is in every way you possibly can to avoid it going underground, to avoid it resulting in these unintended consequences, or to result in some kind of syncretism where people are just fusing bad, broken, inappropriate living somehow in a wrong way with Christianity. And what that does is it forces you towards humility. It forces you towards asking a lot of questions. Well, your role in this process is not to just stamp down what is going to be said. I'm the missionary and I'll declare to you what you must do. Your role in the process is to help gather biblical information. I mean, you've had maybe, I hope, more experience, more training, more understanding, broad understanding of Scripture. And so as they're discussing, you bring different questions. Well, what about this biblical principle? Okay, let's look at this passage. Well, have you considered this? And you're the resource to gather information for them, but you're humbly, carefully, simply walking them through the process, helping them find their way to a well-informed decision. Now, the complexity of this, will the locals always get it right? No. I mean, I don't always get it right in my context, right? I mean, I might know my American Western context, might know it pretty well because I grew up there and have lots of relationships, but there are all kinds of syncretisms and distortions that happen. Just because they're the locals doesn't mean that they will get it right. However, the richness of this is where you have to have a partnership relationship. You work together with them. As an outsider, what's sometimes called the etic perspective, the outsider perspective, you bring a certain perspective, a certain wisdom. From the insider perspective, what's sometimes called the emic perspective, they bring a certain wisdom. And so it's those two together, the outsider and the insider together, the culturally knowledgeable person together with what we hope is a biblically knowledgeable person. And it's those people working together, we hope, that then could be part of finding our way to a good and solid biblical application. This would take me to a concept we're going to discuss a bit later, and that is the richness of missions as an opportunity to struggle through really hard analysis of Scripture. And when a person first goes into a new context, they start to hit new problems, new questions, new issues, new concerns, many of those things that they've never seen before. And their temptation is to just react in shock, like to reject the place. This place is bad. Let me go back to my safe place because I understood the questions there. And the opportunity of missions is, no, actually, what it should force you to do is to go back through and examine the questions more closely. Maybe you thought you understood biblical Christianity. Maybe you thought you understood biblical ethics. You thought that it was all clear and it made sense to you because, yeah, I know exactly what every Christian ought to do. And some of what was going on there was your cultural heritage. And instead, now here's an opportunity to have to work hard, maybe in a way you haven't had to work before, to go back and discover, no, wait, what does Scripture actually say and not say? To examine your ethic more closely, yes, and ultimately to be a more faithful disciple of Jesus Christ by applying and teaching all the things that he has commanded us to do. The hope then for contextualization is the same hope that we hold for all of missions. Remember Jesus Christ's original command to us, that we would go out and we would teach all people to proclaim or to live obediently to all of his word, that we would teach them to observe all the things whatsoever he has commanded us. And if it's possible then, because Jesus commanded it, to teach people in every place to observe all of his commands, contextualization is a necessity of the Great Commission. It's also a privilege of the Great Commission. Let us then take every opportunity, both for the sake of others in the new contexts that we appear in the new places we go, and also for the sake of ourselves, to push away the syncretism that has become normal for us. Let us carefully, attentively, humbly go through the process of contextualization and faithfully apply biblical ethics to our contexts for appropriate and faithful Christian living.